What if the house that was meant to imprison you was actually built to destroy the man who owned it? That is not a hypothetical question. It is what happened at Mercer Plantation in Tennessee in 1847. And the man who made it happen was not a general, not a politician, not a free man with resources and influence. He was an enslaved carpenter named Elias, who could not legally own a single tool he worked with, could not walk off the property without a written pass, could not even claim the work of his own hands as his own. And yet, over the course of 2 years, working in plain sight, surrounded by overseers, watched every single day, Elias built something into the walls of that house that would take everything from the man who commissioned it. The house is gone now. It burned in 1871 under circumstances that were never fully explained. But the story of what was inside it survived. It survived because Elias wanted it to survive. He made sure of that. Let's start with the man himself. Elias was 34 years old in 1845 when Thomas Mercer first put a hammer in his hand and told him to build him the finest house in Shelby County, Tennessee. Mercer had seen Elias work before, had watched him repair the old plantation outbuildings with precision and instinct for structure that was, frankly, remarkable. Elias did not just build things. He understood them. He understood how it moved in heat and contracted in cold. He understood how weight distributed through a frame, how a joint needed to be cut to hold for 50 years rather than 5. He understood, in the wordless and physical way of someone born with a gift, exactly what a building was trying to do and exactly how to help it do it. Mercer recognized this the way a man recognizes money, with immediate and calculating interest. What Mercer did not recognize, what he was constitutionally incapable of recognizing, because it would have required him to see Elias as fully human, was what else was happening inside that mind. While Elias measured and cut and joined and fitted, while he nodded at Mercer's instructions and gave no outward sign of anything beyond careful professional attention, he was also thinking, planning, calculating something that had nothing to do with load-bearing walls and everything to do with justice. But here's the question that changes everything. How did Elias know it would work? How did a man with no formal education, no access to legal documents, no ability to move freely through the world, know enough about what he was doing to be certain that what he built into those walls would eventually do exactly what he intended? The answer to that question is the most surprising part of this entire story, and we will get there. But first, you need to understand what Thomas Mercer was, because the house Elias built was designed specifically for him. Every hidden element, every carefully placed decision, was a response to something specific about the man who had ordered it built. Elias did not build a trap for a stranger. He built one for a man he had watched for 15 years, whose habits he knew better than that man knew himself, whose weaknesses he had cataloged with the patient attention of someone who understands that knowledge, in the right hands, is the only weapon available. Thomas Mercer was 47 years old, a man of enormous physical confidence and almost no self-awareness. He had built Mercer Plantation from a modest inheritance into one of the most productive cotton operations in the county through a combination of genuine business instinct and a complete willingness to extract maximum labor from the people he owned without regard for the human cost. He was not sadistic in any theatrical way. He did not take pleasure in suffering for its own sake. He was something more dangerous than that. He was indifferent. Suffering was irrelevant to his calculations unless it affected productivity. People were variables. Tools were tools. He wanted a house that announced a success. Wide verandas, 2 full stories, a grand staircase visible from the front entrance, a study with floor-to-ceiling shelves of books he never read but believed important to display. He gave Elias the commission with the casual authority of a man who has never doubted that the people around him will execute his vision perfectly. He gave almost no thought to what it meant to hand that commission to someone who had every reason in the world to want him destroyed. And that was his first mistake. Elias began with the foundation. He always began with the foundation, because that was where everything started. That was where the intentions of the building were set in stone, before a single wall went up, and in the foundation of Thomas Mercer's grand house, in a location that would be invisible once the floor was laid, in the precise place where Elias had calculated the weight distribution of the entire structure would be most concentrated. He placed the first thing. It was not a weapon. It was not poison. It was a document. A single folded piece of paper, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, pressed into a gap in the stone foundation, and sealed over with mortar. On that paper, in handwriting that was not supposed to exist because Elias was not supposed to be able to write, were names, dates, numbers, specific and detailed records of transactions that Thomas Mercer had conducted over the previous decade that were, if brought to the attention of the right people, not merely embarrassing, but potentially ruinous. How did Elias know about them? How did he write them down? And what were the other things he left inside every wall? Stay with us, because this story is only just beginning. Here is something that almost no one at Mercer Plantation knew. Elias could read, not just a little, fluently. He had been taught in secret by an elderly enslaved woman named Hester, who had herself been taught decades earlier by a Quaker family in Virginia before she was sold south. Hester had passed the knowledge on the way you pass a flame, carefully cupped against the wind, from one person to the next, always in secret, always at enormous risk, because in Tennessee in the 1840s teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal, and being caught doing it carried consequences that neither teacher nor student could afford to contemplate. Elias had been learning since he was 14. By the time he was 30, he read better than most of the white men on the plantation, and he had been using that ability for years in a way that no one suspected, because the best secrets are the ones hidden inside an assumption. The assumption was that he could not read, so no one was careful about what they left around him. Mercer kept his records in a study that Elias had repaired twice over the years. Ledgers, correspondence, documents relating to the plantation's finances and operations. All of it left openly on shelves and desks because the man who cleaned the room could not read, and the man who fixed the shelves could not read, and the man who would one day build a new study with its floor-to-ceiling bookcases absolutely could not read, except that he could. And he did. And he remembered everything with the precision of someone who has trained his memory the way other people train their bodies, out of necessity, because he could not write things down in any place where they might be found. What Elias had read in that study over 15 years was remarkable. Mercer was involved in a network of financial arrangements that operated in the shadows of his legitimate plantation business. Land deals conducted under false names. A second set of accounts that did not match the official records filed with the county. Most significantly, a series of transactions involving the sale of enslaved people across state lines in ways that violated even the limited legal protections that existed. Sales conducted without proper documentation. People moved and sold and resold in ways that even by the brutal standards of the time were fraudulent and exposed Mercer to serious legal liability if the right people ever saw the evidence. Elias had been cataloging it for years, holding it in his memory, waiting for a moment when he could do something with it. The commission to build the new house was that moment. The document and the foundation was only the beginning. As the walls went up, Elias continued. He was working with a crew of 6 other enslaved men, none of whom knew exactly what he was doing, though some suspected something. In the eastern wall of the study, behind the plaster, sealed inside the cavity between the interior and exterior timbers, he placed a second package. This one contained more documents, transcribed from memory onto paper, that he had obtained through a chain of small thefts so incremental and so spread over time that no one had noticed. Letters, copies of correspondence that Mercer had sent and received, reproduced in Elias's hand, documenting conversations that Mercer would have preferred stayed private. In the wall of the master bedroom, he left something different, not paper. A small carved wooden box, sealed with beeswax, containing a collection of items whose significance would only be clear to someone who already knew the story. A specific kind of accounting token used in a particular type of fraudulent land transaction. A button from a coat that had belonged to a man who had disappeared from the county 3 years earlier under circumstances that had never been explained, and a single folded piece of paper with one name on it and a date. Every item placed with the precision of a man who understood that evidence, to be useful, needed to be found by the right person at the right time. Not now. Not yet. Elias was not building a trap that would spring immediately. He was building one that would spring when it needed to, when circumstances aligned, when the moment arrived. He was thinking in years, possibly decades. He was thinking beyond his own immediate situation toward something larger. But Elias was also a man, not just a strategist. And there was one more thing he left inside those walls that had nothing to do with Mercer's crimes, and everything to do with something far more personal. In the wall of the room that Mercer had designated as a nursery, behind a section of plaster in the far corner, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look and how to remove the panel that Elias had designed to be removable from the inside, he left a space, not filled, empty, a small hollow, carefully finished, dry and protected from the elements, large enough for a person to sit in, large enough specifically for a child. Why? What was the empty space for? Who was supposed to use it? And when? And under what circumstances? That question, the question of the empty room inside the wall, is the one that would not be answered for 4 more years. And the answer, when it came, would change everything about how anyone understood what Elias had actually been building. Because the hidden documents were about destroying Thomas Mercer. But the hidden room was about saving someone else entirely. And those two things, the destruction and the salvation, were connected in a way that Elias had been planning since long before the first stone of the foundation was laid. For years after the house was completed, in the autumn of 1851, a man named Judge Harlan arrived at Mercer Plantation. He came officially with papers, with the authority of the county court behind him, and he came specifically to speak with Thomas Mercer about certain irregularities that had been brought to his attention regarding land transactions dating back nearly a decade. Mercer was not expecting him. He had no reason to expect him. As far as he knew, those transactions were buried in private correspondence and personal ledgers that no one outside his immediate circle had ever seen. He sat across from Judge Harlan in his grand study, surrounded by the books he never read, in the house that Elias built, and he tried to understand how any of this had come to light. He never figured it out. The information that had reached Judge Harlan had come through a chain so carefully constructed that tracing it back to its source was essentially impossible. It had started with a free black man in Memphis named Curtis who worked as a clerk for a law firm and who had received, through means he declined to specify, a set of documents whose contents he recognized as legally significant. Curtis had passed them to a white abolitionist lawyer named Whitfield who had connections to the county court. Whitfield had brought them to Harlan. Harlan had come to Mercer. The documents were in Elias's handwriting. But by the time they reached Harlan, they had passed through enough hands that the handwriting itself was the least interesting thing about them. What mattered was the content. And the content was devastating. Mercer's situation unraveled over following months with the slow, terrible momentum of a structure whose foundations had been compromised. Legal proceedings, forced asset liquidation to cover debts exposed by the investigation. The plantation reduced from 3,000 acres to less than 1,000 as properties had to be sold to satisfy judgments. His standing in the county, which had been the thing he valued most, destroyed by the revelation of fraud that had underpinned it. He never connected it to Elias. That was the final precision of what Elias had built. The trap had no visible mechanism. There was no moment of confrontation, no dramatic revelation, no scene where the enslaved carpenter stood before his master and explained what he'd done. It simply happened, invisibly, the way a building fails when its foundations are wrong, not all at once but steadily, one small collapse leading to another, until the whole structure is unsalvageable. Now, the empty room in the nursery wall. In 1849, 2 years before Judge Harlan's visit, a girl named Pearl had been born on Mercer Plantation, the daughter of an enslaved woman named Louise. Pearl was Thomas Mercer's daughter. Not legally, not acknowledged, not in any way that the law of Tennessee in 1849 would have recognized or cared about, but biologically, undeniably, in the way that everyone on the plantation knew, and no one said aloud. Mercer's daughter, born into bondage, subject to being sold like any other piece of property he owned. Elias had known Louise for 20 years. They had grown up together on the plantation. Louise had been the one who told Elias about Hester and the reading lessons. All those years ago, she was the closest thing to family he had in that place. And when Pearl was born, when it became clear what Pearl was and what Pearl's future would be in Thomas Mercer's world, Elias had made a decision that ran alongside everything else he was building. Parallel to the destruction of Mercer's financial empire, quiet and patient, and just as carefully constructed, he had been building a way out for Pearl. The empty room in the nursery wall was where Pearl hid the night she disappeared. She was 2 years old. Louise carried her there in the deep hours of night, through a panel that only Elias knew how to open, and she placed her inside the small dry space, and she held her there in the dark for 4 hours while the household slept, and then in the hour before dawn she passed Pearl through a window to the hands of a woman waiting outside who was part of a network that Elias had been quietly building for years, different from a document chain, separate and insulated from it, but equally careful. Pearl was gone before sunrise. Louise returned to her quarters. When the morning came and Pearl was discovered missing, the search found nothing, because the room and the wall showed no signs of entry or exit, because Elias had designed it that way, and because Elias himself was among the first people questioned and gave the overseers exactly nothing to work with. Pearl reached Ohio. She grew up free. She lived to see the end of the war, lived to see the legal end of the system that had tried to define her entire existence. She had children, and her children had children, and somewhere in a long chain of descended lives is the reason this story survived at all. Because Pearl knew what her mother had told her, which is what Louise had been told by Elias, which is what Elias had always intended for her to know. The house held her secret. The walls kept her safe. And the man who built them had put her freedom inside the foundation before he had laid a single floor. The house burned in 1871. No one was ever charged. No cause was ever officially determined. Elias had been sold away from Mercer Plantation in 1852 in the aftermath of the financial collapse, and his trail after that becomes difficult to follow in the records. There is a man named Elias listed in census documents in Cincinnati in 1865, a carpenter, age listed as approximately 52, which would be consistent. Whether it is the same man, no one can say with certainty. But here's what we know. A man was given a hammer and told to build a house for the man who owned him, and he built it. He built it perfectly, with craftsmanship that people still remarked upon years later. He built it as instructed, on time, within the materials he was given, to the exact specifications requested. And inside every wall, in the spaces between the wood and the plaster, in the gaps where no one thought to look because no one imagined there was anything to find, he built something else, something that could not be owned, could not be sold, could not be taken from him when the day's work was done, and he walked back to the quarters in the dark. He built the end of Thomas Mercer. He built the freedom of a child. And he built a story that the walls could not contain forever.